In 1943, Lady Bird Johnson made a bold and highly scrutinized investment when she purchased a struggling Austin radio station for $7,500. At the time, few could have predicted that this single decision would become the foundation of a media empire and, decades later, the subject of persistent public debate. Within only 6 months of the purchase, the Federal Communications Commission approved a series of regulatory changes that normally took years to obtain. These approvals arrived with unusual speed, raising quiet questions in political and media circles. Her husband was serving in Congress during this period, and by the 1960s her personal fortune had expanded into the millions. Over time, informal discussions and rumors emerged suggesting behind-the-scenes influence, including possible favors and private communications with federal regulators. For years, none of these claims could be proven. Yet newly revealed documents now paint a far more layered and complicated picture. The central question remains difficult to ignore. How did a soft-spoken woman from rural Texas build a powerful broadcasting empire while her husband helped shape national legislation? The answer, as emerging evidence suggests, may be far more unsettling than previously believed. Claudia Alta Taylor was born on December 22, 1912, in a grand home known locally as the Brick House. This two-story, 17-room residence stood on a gentle rise near Karnak, Texas, and seemed designed to preserve family history within its walls. Her lineage carried both economic influence and historical depth. Her father, Thomas Jefferson Taylor II, arrived in Texas in the mid-1890s and quickly established himself as a successful businessman. He often described his occupation as being a dealer in everything, a phrase that reflected the wide reach of his ventures. He operated a general store, owned 2 additional rural stores, ran a cotton gin, and managed a large plantation, steadily expanding his land holdings throughout the early decades of the 20th century. Her family history even extended far beyond Texas, tracing back to Rowland Taylor, an English Protestant martyr who was executed on February 9, 1555, during the reign of Queen Mary I amid the persecution of Protestants. Although she was born Claudia Alta Taylor, that name would gradually fade from daily use. A nickname given in her earliest days ultimately became her identity. Her nursemaid Alice Tittle once looked at the infant and remarked that she was as pretty as a ladybird. That simple, affectionate observation would permanently shape how she was known to the world. Over time, debate emerged about whether the term referred to a bird or the small red beetle commonly known as a ladybug, but the interpretation mattered less than the fact that the name endured. By the time she reached college, Lady Bird had fully replaced Claudia Alta Taylor in everyday life, pushing her given name into near obscurity. Her childhood, however, was far from uninterrupted happiness. On September 14, 1918, when she was only 5 years old, she experienced a loss that would permanently reshape her world. Her mother, Minnie Lee Patillo Taylor, born on May 16, 1874 in Alabama, was a striking and unconventional woman with a deep love of opera and a persistent feeling of displacement in rural East Texas life. She often wore long white dresses and veils, and she struggled with both physical illness and emotional instability. During a pregnancy, Minnie suffered a devastating accident when she fell down the full length of the brick house's circular staircase. The fall resulted in a miscarriage, and complications that followed ultimately led to her death. Lady Bird was present in the home and witnessed the aftermath, while her 2 older brothers, Tommy and Tony, were away attending boarding school in the Catskills of New York. Later in life, she acknowledged that even the exact details of her mother's death remained unclear in her memory, and relatives expressed frustration when inconsistencies were discovered on Minnie's gravestone. After this tragedy, the large family home remained physically unchanged but emotionally emptied. Into that void stepped Minnie's sister, Effie Patillo. Unmarried and steady in temperament, Effie moved from Alabama to Karnak and made the brick house her permanent home. She became the closest maternal figure in Lady Bird's life, filling a role that had been abruptly taken away. As she grew older, Lady Bird lived between 2 contrasting family worlds that rarely blended together. One side reflected her mother's Alabama heritage, cultured, expressive, and socially distinctive, while the other reflected her father's practical, business-driven mindset focused on commerce and expansion. Each summer, until she reached the age of 20, Aunt Effie brought her back to Autauga County, Alabama, to visit relatives. Those journeys became emotional refuges, offering her a sense of belonging and freedom that she often lacked at home in Texas. She later reflected that, during her youth, summer was essentially synonymous with Alabama, as though those seasons belonged entirely to that world. Effie's presence in her life remained constant for decades. Even after Lady Bird married Lyndon Johnson and relocated to Austin in 1935, her aunt continued living with the family, remaining a stable and familiar presence within their household. Yet education created its own separation. Karnak had no high school, which forced her to leave home to continue her studies. While her brothers were sent to expensive boarding schools, she lived during the week with non-family caretakers, including a local garden club leader in Jefferson, though some accounts place her in Marshall, while attending Marshall Senior High School. Quiet and introverted by nature, she found comfort in outdoor spaces, but it was literature that gave her emotional stability. Classical works offered her a structured and unchanging world during a time when her personal life felt unstable. Despite periods of loneliness, she excelled academically and graduated in 1928 at the age of 15, finishing third in her class. That early independence did not make her outspoken, but it did build a quiet determination. One former boyfriend later described her as one of the most resolute people he had ever known. Years later, that same determination appeared in her business life when she acquired KTBC, a failing Austin radio station. What followed was a transformation that seemed almost improbable given the slow and rigid nature of broadcasting regulation at the time. Within 6 months of purchase, she secured FCC approval to move the station from 1150 to the far more valuable 590 AM frequency, dramatically improving its reach across 38 Texas counties by reducing signal interference. She also obtained approval for increased broadcasting power and permission for full-time operation beyond daylight hours. By July 1943, these changes were finalized. In August, the station recorded its first monthly profit, just $18, but symbolically significant as proof of survival. By October, earnings had risen into the hundreds, and by 1945 KTBC was generating nearly $40,000 annually after taxes. This early success became the foundation of a larger broadcasting enterprise and significantly increased the Johnson family's wealth. Another breakthrough came in August 1943, when Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson persuaded William S. Paley, president of CBS, to affiliate KTBC with the network. Paley initially resisted, arguing that Austin did not require its own CBS outlet due to coverage from San Antonio. However, the decision ultimately went through, granting KTBC access to highly popular national programming, including dramas, comedies, news broadcasts, sports coverage, soap operas, and music shows. Advertisers quickly followed the audience. Observers later suggested that Lyndon Johnson's position in Congress may have influenced the outcome, as broadcasting executives were highly sensitive to regulatory pressure. CBS Research Director Frank Stanton ultimately approved the affiliation, transforming KTBC into a dominant regional station almost overnight. Lady Bird's ambitions did not stop with radio. In 1952, she expanded into television despite concerns from her husband, investing in VHF equipment to ensure stronger signal coverage across Central Texas. On November 27, 1952, Thanksgiving Day, KTBC-TV aired the first television broadcast in Austin, featuring a University of Texas versus Texas A&M football game, which ended in a 32-2 victory for Texas. For 7 years, KTBC remained the only television station in Central Texas, giving the Johnson family extraordinary influence over advertising revenue and programming decisions. Later accounts suggested that Lyndon Johnson used his Senate position to help protect the station's license, further strengthening the family's financial position. Despite these professional achievements, their marriage faced serious strain. Lyndon Johnson's extramarital relationships were widely known within Washington political circles, including a long-running affair with Alice Glass that began in 1937. Although discovered in 1939, the relationship continued intermittently into the early 1960s. Lady Bird endured public humiliation as these stories circulated, while biographers described Johnson as sometimes openly boastful about his behavior. Reports also documented his volatile temper, including harsh and humiliating remarks directed at her. Over time, those close to the family observed her becoming increasingly quiet and withdrawn. Even so, she rarely adopted the role of a victim in public. Instead, she often reframed painful experiences with restraint and composure, sometimes discussing figures like Alice Glass in terms of influence rather than betrayal. She redirected her energy into public service, particularly environmental causes, and her nationwide campaign for beautification, maintaining purpose even during personal hardship. Everything changed on November 22, 1963. While traveling in the Dallas motorcade, two vehicles behind President John F. Kennedy, Lady Bird witnessed the sudden collapse of celebration into chaos when gunfire erupted in Dealey Plaza at approximately 12:30 p.m. The motorcade sped to Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Later that day, at 2:38 p.m., aboard Air Force One, she stood by as her husband was sworn in as President of the United States beside Jacqueline Kennedy. In less than 3 hours, her entire life had been transformed. 8 days later, she began recording her memories as a form of emotional release, producing a 7-minute and 21-second audio statement in which she described the experience as being violently tossed like waves in an endless sea. These recordings were later incorporated into the Warren Commission's investigation, though they were annotated and edited, including contributions from advisor Abe Fortas. Portions of the assassination-related documentation were not made public until 2001, revealing how tightly controlled the flow of information had been even at the highest levels of government. The tragedy was deepened by the life that might have been. The Johnsons had originally planned to host the Kennedys at their Texas ranch following the Dallas visit, including horseback riding and a homemade pecan pie prepared by Lady Bird at Kennedy's request. Instead, the ranch remained empty, and the day ended in national mourning rather than hospitality. In the years that followed, Lady Bird Johnson remained deeply involved in public life, policy influence, and historical documentation. Between 1963 and 1969, she recorded 123 hours of personal audio diaries, capturing the unfolding of civil rights struggles, the escalation of the Vietnam War, and the immense pressure placed on the presidency. Her recordings ultimately became a vital historical record, offering an intimate view of one of the most turbulent eras in American history.